Do you start the recording? All right, good. Thank you. All right. Hello, everyone. Salam, namaste, adab, and welcome at Indian Diaspora. Today's talk is sharing a room with the Sparrow, Maulana Azad, and the question of minority agents in India. The speaker is Dr. Anand Vivek Taneja, who is an associate professor of religious studies at Vanderbilt. He was also, I think he studied at Jamia also for a while. And his interest is on the religious and cultural tradition of South Asia, specializing in the anthropological study of contemporary Islam, Indian popular culture. He will be formally introduced by Dr. Manan Ahmed. Rather, I'll introduce Dr. Manan Ahmed and Dr. Shaunna Rodrigues. Dr. Manan Ahmed is an associate professor of history at Columbia University. His specialty is on South Asia and also on the critical philosophy and history of the colonial and anti-colonial thoughts. He had two books to his credit, a book of conquest, that is the Fatah-Nama-e-Sindh, and the second is Loss of Hindustan, the Invention of India. He is a native from Pakistan, and the concluding remarks will be given by Dr. Shaunna Rodrigues, who has recently finished her PhD at Columbia, and had recently joined also as an early career fellow in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at the same Columbia University. Her earlier studies were at St. Stephen College, as well as at JNU. She is from Mangalore, Karnataka. And welcome you all. And now I invite Dr. Manan Ahmed for his introductory remarks on the topic, as well as on Dr. Anand Vivek Taneja. Thank you.
Bahut shukriya, adabars. Everyone, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, thank you. So I'm really delighted to be here and to formally introduce Professor Anand Taneja. Some of you may know of his work from his first book, which was lauded and appreciated across many disciplines. Genealogy, I don't know what the pronunciation in English is, but genealogy, time, Islam, and ecological thought in the medieval ruins of Delhi, which centered on Firoz Shah Kotla, stories of belonging, of how different forms of life kind of imagines itself, survives, is contested. It was an ethnography. As an anthropologist, he spent a lot of time there, but it was also a meditation on how we think about things, these big categories, such as religion and citizenship. And that work, I think, is useful as a starting point to what you will hear now and what he has been working on for the last few years on his book, which is, I think, maybe tentatively titled The Gabriel of Madness, Indian Muslim Poetry, Ethics, and Politics in an Age of Hindu Nationalism. So the titles of both of these books, I think, orient us to the main critical and hermeneutical interests that Dr. Taneja brings to his ethnography. That is to say, the ways in which poetry, a type of understanding of citizenship and belonging, and the physical and material infrastructure, the world we inhabit, who do we inhabit with, what do they who we inhabit with say about the world, interlink in his analysis. And I think as he's saying, age of Hindu nationalism. I'm not sure what is the kind of time frame. I'm a medievalist, so time becomes rather important for me. I don't know what the age of Hindu nationalism is. Is it the entirety of the 20th century? Is it just since 2015 or 2014? But what is important is that we see, whether within or without the age of Hindu nationalism, a contestation of our history and memory. So the most kind of visible artifacts, of course, is the erasure of Mughal names or the word Mughal. Now Nehru has been removed from Nehru Memorial Library. You have a rebuilding of Delhi as an infrastructure. And in this kind of erasure of words which are tied to not only to lives and meaning making, but also to communities, is the larger project that I think this paper today orients us. So it focuses on Maulana Azad, but it's also, I think, my beginning, my contribution in the beginning is simply to remind us all that behind these contestations over particular historical figures is an incredibly deep-rooted segregation that has happened, that is focused on Muslim communities in India. A very important study just came out 2-3 days ago by a set of sociologists and political sciences in Dartmouth, which looked at the at the local level, residential and educational segregation in India. And what they find is quite, I think, eye-opening in the sense that over 1.5 million urban and rural neighborhoods, which they have examined in their study, the lack of public access to public facilities like education, like schools, hospitals, and the places in which they inhabit are more segregated than ever before, but more segregated than anyone had ever imagined before, and even more segregated than the Dalit communities or scheduled caste communities. So there is a physical, material infrastructure under which these contestations of what is the meaning of Azad and why a particular statue should or should not stay, which is, I'm sure you will hear about. And I want to thank Anand for this research, because it's incredibly important that we think about the semantic as well as the social and the cultural resonances of this work. So I'll stop here. I'm going to put the studies link in the chat for those of you who want to kind of follow up. The full paper is at the bottom of the link. And with that, I join you in welcoming Professor Taneja and his lecture.
Thank you very much, Manan and Razi Saab, for the introduction. Adab, everyone. I am very lucky to have had Professor Manan Ahmed Asif as a member of my dissertation committee. And as you can see, his intellectual insights have always been deeply influential for my work. So I'm very thankful for his ongoing friendship. And I'm very thankful to Shaunna for agreeing to be a respondent to this, since her dissertation work centers, in a sense, on Maulana Azad. So I will start without much ado. I'll start sharing the screen and start giving the paper. Hopefully it should be within 45 minutes, and then I look forward to the conversation that is to follow. All right. On Sunday, March 25th, 2018, Ram Navami, a day that marks the birth of the Hindu god Ram, a crowd pulled down a statue of Maulana Abul Kalam Azad in Kankinada, a small town in West Bengal about a half an hour north of Kolkata by train. Azad was a major figure in the Indian national movement, the first education minister of independent India, a respected and highly original Muslim thinker and theologian. A video of the event started circulating shortly after on social media. In the video, shops are shuttered, fires are burning, and a crowd of young men in saffron headbands mills around, spewing profanities in Hindi. The cell phone camera roams the scene, a participant observer Wantage gleefully recording the carnage and exhorting the crowd to raise the chant of Jai Hindu, victory to Hindus, and then zooms in on a scene a little bit further down the road. Young men have converged on a statue on a plinth under a canopy at the side of the road. They shake the statue back and forth, loosening it from the plinth, then wrench off the statue and throw it into the street. A few months later, in August 2018, I visited Kankinada. My interlocutors there told me that the statue was attacked during the Ram Navami procession, which was led by the local MLA, member of the State Legislative Assembly, Arjun Singh, who belongs to the secular TMC Trinamool Congress, and who had assured people that no violence would happen. Some members of the Bharatiya Janata Party, the Hindu nationalist BJP, in their account, broke from the procession and attacked the mostly Muslim shops in the main bazaar and broke the statue. Nobody knows exactly who did it, I heard more than once, as well as these people were outsiders. But people were unsettled because of Arjun Singh's involvement. Most insisted that things are back to normal, that everyone in the local community thought that what had happened was wrong, that the statue had been rebuilt. When I visited, it stood under transparent tarpaulin, fresh cement affixing it to the plinth, awaiting inauguration. But things had shifted, as Anup told me. The RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the Hindu nationalist paramilitary voluntary organization which serves as the ideological fount for the BJP and other Hindu nationalist political organizations, didn't have a presence in Kankinada before the riots, and now they had several shakhas or branches. The TMC, he said, is abetting their presence and the violence because they believe that creating an atmosphere of fear would consolidate the Muslim vote with them. And as for Arjun Singh, Anup said he was with the Congress before, now he's with the TMC, and he could very well be with the BJP next time. And in the 2019 general elections, Arjun Singh became a member of the National Parliament from Barakpur constituency as a member of the BJP. The statue was erected in September or October 2017, I was told, in addition to the pantheon of statues of national leaders already present in the area: Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar. What struck me even as I was told this was the belatedness of Azad's addition to the local pantheon. Azad's statue was added only in 2017, 70 years after independence, and was attacked within 6 months. Who was Maulana Azad? I asked my local interlocutors, most of whom belonged to a leftist political party marginalized in Bengal politics by both the TMC and BJP. What do you know about him? They said they really didn't know. This is a town of working class people. What will we know? We just know that he was one of the great freedom fighters, that he spoke against the partition of the country, that he stopped many people from going to Pakistan. One of the comrades, who was Muslim, said that Azad was the person who convinced our forefathers to stay. Is mitti ke ho, yahin pe raho. You are of this earth, so stay here. Otherwise, many more people would have gone to Pakistan. Later, when we met Shamsher, who worked for the local municipality, the same sentiment was repeated. Maulana Azad is the one who convinced our forefathers not to go to Pakistan, he said. It became painfully clear while speaking to my interlocutors in Kankinada why Maulana Azad's statue had been attacked. He was seen as a symbol of Muslim persistence in India, a persistence which the BJP's vision of a Hindu India had no space for. On 24th October 1947, Maulana Azad gave the khutbah, the sermon before the Friday prayers, at the Jama Masjid in Delhi, a grand building dating back to the time of the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan and one of the most important mosques of India. In Sayyida Hamid's words, it was a very special event, as also are the circumstances in which the invitation had been extended to Azad to deliver the sermon. The Muslims of Delhi had been huddled in their homes with fear of the Hindu backlash. Thousands of them had been killed or forced to migrate to Pakistan in the wake of the massacres which had occurred on both sides of the new border. The leaders of the Muslim League had fled from India to their newly born country. In that desolate autumn of 1947, the Indian Muslims felt that they had been deserted and abandoned. It was in these circumstances that Maulana Azad, serving as education minister in the government of newly independent India, a man who had always considered the idea of a separate Muslim homeland as a mistake, theologically, ethically, and politically, addressed the battered and fearful Muslim community at the grand and historic Jama Masjid, a symbol of Mughal sovereignty and a glorious Indian Muslim past, and convinced many of those who were considering migrating to Pakistan, largely out of fear, to stay in India. I quote, "I do not say to you that you should obtain a certificate of loyalty from the school of the ruling authority or choose the very life of beggary that was your custom in the age of foreign rulers. I say that these shining designs and patterns that are visible to you in this Hindustan as a memory of the past, that was your caravan, do not forget them. Do not forsake them. Live like their worthy inheritors and understand that if you are not ready to run away, then no power can make you flee. Come, pledge that this country is ours, we are for it, and any fundamental decisions about its destiny will remain incomplete without our voice." In Indian Muslim memory, Azad's speech serves as a landmark moment where, despite the bloodshed and intercommunal hatred of partition, Indian Muslims were convinced to remain in and to imagine a future in a Hindu-majority India, despite being greatly weakened as a political community by the creation of Pakistan. Azad's speech is a decisive moment in the Muslim picture of the past, a moment when the parents and grandparents of today's Indian Muslim youth made a choice to stay in secular India and rejected the idea of Pakistan as a Muslim homeland. In this picture, without Azad and the collective decision of millions of Muslims to not opt for Pakistan that his person and his speech embodied, the much wanted ethos of Indian secularism would not exist. Which makes it particularly galling for Indian Muslims that Azad has been marginalized and largely forgotten in the popular history of the Indian nation state. For instance, the event to commemorate Maulana Azad's birth anniversary held at the Jama Masjid on 11 November 2018 was marked by the absence of major politicians, including leaders of the Indian National Congress, several of whom had been invited but had not responded. Any public involvement with or endorsement of Muslims was now seen as an electoral liability in an age of Hindutva dominating public discourse. No one remembers Azad, not even the Congress, the party to which he committed his life. He has been relegated to a corner of political hoardings, a man with a topi and beard, a Muslim caricature, wrote Sayyida Hamid, formerly a member of the Planning Commission of India and a scholar of Azad's life and work, in an opinion column published shortly after the demolition of Azad's statue in Kankinara. Along with being a politically astute visionary who foresaw how the partition would weaken India's Muslims politically, Maulana Azad also articulated a theologically grounded vision of Muslim belonging in a multi-confessional India, which continues to be relevant for Indian Muslims today. A vision which is being revived along with Azad's memory at a time when Muslim belonging in India is yet again being questioned. Crucial to Azad's political and theological vision was a re-evaluation of the term minority. In Azad's understanding, India's Muslims were not a disadvantaged demographic category, but held a position of social and moral leadership. Azad's understanding of minority beyond demography as a morally agentive category rather than one which is the recipient of the majority's noblesse oblige or secular chivalry, while largely articulated in colonial and yet unpartitioned India, is one which has enormous resonance and relevance in post-colonial India too. In this talk, I will first revisit a moment of the revival of Azad's memory in Jamia Nagar, Delhi's preeminent Muslim majority area and Muslim intellectual center. Then I will turn to Azad's writings in his last book published in pre-partition India, Ghubar-e-Khatir, a polyvalent title which has been translated both as Dust of Memories and as Vapor of the Soul. Finally, I will turn to the Shaheen Bagh protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act in 2019 and 2020 and see how these protests resonated with the vision of minority agency articulated by Azad in Ghubar-e-Khatir. On the afternoon of January 13, 2018, an event remembering Maulana Azad was organized on the lawns of Sayyida Hamid's home near Tikona Park at the heart of Jamia Nagar. The vibrant and diverse collection of Muslim settlements that has grown up around Jamia Millia Islamia, a major Muslim educational institution and one of Delhi's 3 premier central universities. The event, titled Maine Tumhe Pukara, I Call to You, was a dramatized presentation of Maulana Azad's writings. The title itself alluded to Maulana Azad's 1947 sermon at the Jama Masjid, where he said to the gathered congregation, alluding to his warnings against the perils of the two-nation theory, Maine tumhe pukara, tumne meri zaban kaat di. I call to you, you cut off my tongue. Over 150 people, young and old, were present at the event, which also continues to have an afterlife on YouTube. One of the speakers was the subaltern historian Shahid Amin, who read a letter from Ghubare Khatir, a collection originally written as a series of unposted letters to Maulana Azad's friend Habibur Rahman Khan Sherwani, while Azad was being held as a political prisoner in Ahmednagar Fort in central India from 1942 to 1945 at the height of the Second World War. Ghubare Khatir is considered a classic of Urdu belles-lettres and is often treated as literary rather than religious or political, but it also embodies the genre of letter writing as an important mode of articulating and cultivating ethical selfhood in pre-colonial Muslim societies. It was to elucidate an ethical lesson on how majorities should live with minorities that Shahid Amin read out letter 19 from Ghubare Khatir, titled Chidiya Chire Chide Ki Kahani, the tale of the she-sparrow and he-sparrow. The letter is dated 17th March 1943. The protagonists of this story are sparrows who have made their nests in the eaves of Azad's room and are dropping plaster and twigs and other nesting material all over his clothes, his desk, and wash basin. Last August, when we came here, the nest making of these sparrows had troubled me a lot. Azad describes the havoc the sparrows and the construction debris caused in his room in humorous detail, and then gives a mock heroic account of his war with the birds. For a few days, I was patient, but after a while, my tolerance categorically gave up, and the decision had to be made that now there is no solution without a fight. Among my possessions here, an umbrella has also come along. I picked it up and made a declaration of war, but in just a little while, I found out that a short reach of the umbrella is no match for these swift enemies atop arches. Azad then found a long bamboo pole used to clean spider webs in the veranda outside his room and managed to chase the sparrows away. Satisfied that he had the room to himself, he sat down to write. But not even 15 minutes must have passed, and the sounds of the enemy's battle song and the fluttering of their wings arose again. When I raised my head to look, every crevice in the ceiling was occupied by them. I immediately got up and, bringing the bamboo pole, again joined battle. This time, the sparrows are quite obstinate in holding their ground, but ultimately they retreat and leave the room to Azad. Since they seem scared of the bamboo pole, which Azad, continuing the mock heroic tone of his account, calls a neza, spear, he decides to keep it in his room and props it in such a way that the tip of the pole is close to the opening of the oldest of the nests in the room. He then leaves his room for lunch. When he comes back a little while later, he finds that the sparrows are back in the crevices in the room and seem to be entirely unaffected by the incident. And the most notable thing was that the weapon whose terror I had trusted to such an extent had become an instrument of the enemy's activities. The tip of the bamboo pole, which was touching the opening of the nest, has started serving as a threshold. They choose their twigs and come sit on this newly erected threshold, and with ease and comfort, they lay them out in the nest. Seeing the state of affairs, Azad realizes he cannot chase the birds away. And now I thought that I should choose such rituals and ways, rasmorah, with which one can live together in one house with uninvited guests. First, he moved his bed away from the wall so that the debris from the bird's nest construction wouldn't fall on his bed. He ordered dust cloths to cover the surface of the table with the wash basin. Against the still quite prevalent taboos against men of high stature doing menial work, especially the polluting work of sweeping, Azad hid a broom in his room and would discreetly sweep the room a few times a day, when his neighbors in adjacent cells couldn't see him. See how in being hospitable to these uninvited guests, I even had to sweep. Ishq az een bisyar kar dasto kunad. Love has done a lot of things of this kind and will do more. एक दिन ख्याल हुआ कि जब सुलह हो ही गई है तो चाहिए कि पूरी तरह सुलह हो. ये ठीक नहीं कि रहें एक ही घर में और रहें बेगानों की तरह. One day the thought came that when an accommodation has happened between us, then the peace should be total. It is not right that we live in one home, but we live as strangers. I have translated the word sulah, which Azad uses twice in the passage above, as both accommodation and peace. This is in keeping with the multiple meanings of the word in Islamic legal and ethical traditions, and its particular uses in Mughal discourses of governance and selfhood. As Rajiv Kinra shows, the concept of Sulh-e-Kul, peace for all, as it was developed in the time of the Mughal Emperor Akbar and continues to have a life well into 20th century Urdu discourse, was not just a strategy of governance, but also a habitus one aimed to embody, an aspirational state towards which one fashioned the self. This was a spiritual state of being able to deal with one's fellow beings, irrespective of their radical differences, religious or otherwise, with equal consideration and respect, without any bigotry, discrimination, or anger. It is this thicker sense of sulah that Azad seems to be gesturing towards when he uses the term a second time. Azad desires to move from the tolerance that the truce-like sulah between him and the birds has brought about to something deeper and more intimate. This is what he wishes to call a complete accommodation or total peace, puri tarah sulah. Bringing this collective condition about, this fostering of intimacy requires, as Azad recounts, a transformation of the self. You know that far more than the hunted, it is the hunter who has to keep watch upon the self. As soon as their feet turned towards the grains that Azad had scattered on the rug, I held my breath still, turned my gazes in the other direction, and turned my entire body insensate and inert like a stone, as if it's not a man but a stone idol, murti, placed there. Because I knew that if the gaze of passion, becoming agitated, hastened things even a little bit, then the hunted birds, having come closer and closer to the net, would fly away. This is but the first stage in the matters of the coquetry of beauty and the sacrifices of love. Anyway, I passed this ordeal akin to the beloved's neglectful behavior by repeating God's name, and an idle mocker, But Tannaz, from among the birds, clearly made his way to the grains. Azad then describes in great detail the approach of the birds to the grains and starts introducing us to individuals within the flock of sparrows with distinct and different personalities. He is so taken by these personalities that he wishes to have closer, deeper relations with them. This male sparrow's confident step was such a heart-pleasing happening that at the very moment I resolved that I had to have more frequent relations with this man of action, I named him Qalandar. For in the acts of his heedlessness and freedom, there was also gallantry that added a luster to his Qalandaresque ways. Azad started feeding the birds regularly, 2 or 3 times a day. After a few days, instead of scattering the grains of rice on the rug, he put them in the inverted lid of a cigarette tin and placed this on the rug. The next day, he placed the tin a little bit away from the rug and closer to himself. On the third day, he placed the tin virtually in front of himself. On seeing such closeness, qurb, at first the guests were hesitant. They came close to the rug, but there was a hesitant flinch in their steps and a wavering spoke in their eyes. But at the very moment Qalandar appeared, crying out his Qalandaresque slogans, and seeing his non-conforming libertinesque rindana audacities, everyone's hesitation vanished, as if they had all become followers of Qalandar on this path. Azad kept bringing the lid of the cigarette tin with its cargo of rice grains closer and closer to himself by degrees. As before, the birds would hesitate till Qalandar took the first step, and this stage too opened on all the other birds. One morning, Azad put the lid with the rice in it right by his side, and then became so engrossed in his writing that he forgot about it. In a little while, he heard the loud sound of a bird hitting its beak on something. When I looked out of the corner of the eye, I saw that our old friend Kalandar has reached and is using his beak without any hesitation. As the lid was placed right next to me, his tail was touching my knee. In a little while, the other swift-moving friends also reached, and then the condition was such that at every moment, a group of 2 or 3 friends would be jumping around at my side without any hesitation. In their unceremonious prancing, it so happened many a time that thinking of my shoulder as the low branch of a tree, they thought of making it a target of their exploration, but then turned back startled or touched my shoulder with their wings and passed over. Anyway, these deer of the air slowly came to the belief that this visage that is always seen on the sofa while being a human is not dangerous like humans are. See the enchantment of love, which does not tame humans, but tames wild birds. Many times it happened that I am lost in my thoughts, engrossed in writing. Suddenly, a heart-pleasing phrase came to the tip of my pen, or the appropriateness of some lesson made me remember a couplet full of moods and meanings, and without conscious control, my head and shoulders started moving in the mood of the couplet, or I exclaimed, "Ha!" And all of a sudden, loudly, I heard the sound of flying wings. When I looked, I saw that a group of those friends without any formality had been busy with their prancing at my side. Suddenly, they saw that the stone has started moving, so they were afraid and flew off. It would not be strange if they said to themselves that on the sofa here a stone is placed, but sometimes it becomes a man. On finishing reading the letter, Shahid Amin commented upon it, and allow me to play the slide for.
तो जनाब, ये जो पंचतंत्र नुमा एक कहानी है, आमिर मुफ्ती ने उसको एक एलेगरी कहा है कि रिलेशनशिप बिटवीन माइनॉरिटी एंड मेजॉरिटी. आप ज्यादा ताकतवर हैं, दूसरा एक कोने में है, एक अपना घोंसले बनाने की कोशिश कर रहा है. घोंसला आपकी जो रिहाइश है उसमें नहीं है, आपकी जमीन नहीं ले रहा है, बंटवारा नहीं हो रहा है, वो ऊपर है, आप नीचे हैं, 3 टियर 1 टियर ग्राउंड फ्लोर जो भी है चल सकता है. लेकिन क्योंकि ये घर आपका है, हालांकि उसमें आप कैद हैं, तो इसलिए आप उससे अपनी दुश्मनी निकालेंगे. इससे बड़ी.
On finishing reading the letter, Shahid Amin commented upon it. This Panchatantra-like story, Amir Mufti has spoken of it as an allegory for the relationship between minority and majority. You are more powerful, the other is in a corner, trying to make his nest. The nest is not in your living space. It is not taking land from you. There is no partition or division. He is above, you are below, 3 tier, 2 tier, 1 tier. Whatever it is, you can make it work. But since this house is yours, even though you are imprisoned within it, you will take your enmity out on the other. In choosing to read this letter and in his commentary upon it, Shahid Amin was drawing on the literary scholar Amir Mufti's book, Enlightenment in the Colony, in which Mufti has read Maulana Azad's account of sharing his room with birds as an allegory that, I quote, composed 4 years before the communal holocaust of partition that was to shake the subcontinent, is a politico-ethical critique of the escalations and political failures that were hurtling society towards its own disintegration. The allegory is about the relative alignment of forces that structures the life of society into majority and minority domains, and the adjustments called for from the majority in order to achieve an ethical practice of coexistence. Now, this interpretation of Mufti's is given weight by the coding in the story of the birds as Muslim. The religiously marked terms used for them include Qalandar and Buttanaz, idol mocker, and the human in the story as a Hindu idol, Murti. But to read the story as calling for adjustments only from the majority, as Amir Mufti and following him Shahid Amin do, is to miss the profoundly agentive role that the birds play not just in this letter, but even more in the subsequent letter Azad addressed to his friend on the next day, 18th March 1943. This agentive role of the birds in creating Sulah makes the extended allegory not only about the adjustments called for from the majority, but equally the agency that minorities can and should wield in remaking the relationship in remaking the relationships that constitute an ethical practice of coexistence across radical differences, including power differentials. This latter reading is much more in line with both Azad's broader idea of Muslim agency in an undivided India, as well as with contemporary Indian Muslim political thinking. The story that began yesterday, it hasn't yet finished. Come today, let me tell you another chapter of this Conference of the Birds, Mantiq at-Tayr. Thus began Azad's letter dated 18th March. The Conference of the Birds is, of course, the famous allegorical poem by the Persian poet Fariduddin Attar, in which 30 birds go out on a quest to find the legendary king of the birds, a complex avian allegory for the human soul's journey to find the divine. Azad's invocation of the Conference of the Birds is not just humorous, though it is certainly that. Throughout the previous letter, he spoke of the receding fear of the birds and their growing closeness to him as different stations, maqamat, of a spiritual quest, stages in the transformation of the soul. In the previous letter, Azad wrote of the transformations that his desire for intimacy with the birds had wrought on him. He abjured interspecies violence, he took up the low-status work of sweeping, and he embodies a stillness which turned him into a stone that sometimes becomes a man. But the journey was not yet complete. There were more stages to come. Between these friends of the roof and arches and me, there remained a light veil of fear and agitation. But in a few days, even this was lifted. To come from the ceiling to the sofa, they needed a few intermediate stages. For the first stage, they would use the blades of the ceiling fan. For the second, my head and shoulders. From the fan, they would descend directly onto my shoulder, cheer up for a little while, and then jump to the sofa. Many times, it also happened that they would leap from my shoulder to sit atop my head. When matters reached till there, then I thought, why not have another experience? One morning, Azad put the container with the rice grains on his open palm after a delay in the usual time of bringing it out. As before, Qalandar was the first sparrow to unhesitatingly jump onto his fingers to peck at the grain. Now I lifted my palm with the container on it so it was hanging in the air. Only a little while had passed when another sparrow came. In a little while, you will come to know that her name is Moti, pearl. Moti circled my palm once or twice. Then she landed on my elbow and made straight for the wrist and started pecking at the grains without any hesitation. But this last experience put this experiment-loving, kavish pasand temperament into a different train of thought altogether. I was ashamed at this shortcoming in the flavor of my love that my palm is available and I'm wasting the lancet blows of these beaks on a tin lid. The next day, I removed the tin lid and placed the grains of rice on the palm of my hand. And I placed my hand palm open on the sofa. Moti was the first to come, and she kept raising her neck to see why the lid wasn't visible today. She is the most beautiful sparrow of the settlement. If we follow the way of beauty pageants for Moti, then we can call her Madam Kila Ahmednagar. A lean body, a graceful neck, a tapering cone-like tail, and in her round eyes, a strange kind of innocent speaking. When she comes to peck at the grains, with each grain, she will keep looking at me. Both our tongues remain silent, but our eyes have begun to speak. She has begun to understand the language of my glances. I have learned to read her gaze. Anyway, at this moment too, her spontaneous gaze said something to me. And then, without any hesitation, she leapt onto the base of my thumb and started pecking at the grains with her beak. This was not a beak, this was the tip of a lancet, which if she had wanted, could have gone clean through my palm. But she would eat the grains, giving me only scratches. Every time she would also turn her neck and look at me as if she was asking me, "You're not in pain, are you?" What answer could I give, I who could give my life for the pleasure of that pain? नशेमन के लिए तिनके चुनूंगा फिर गुलिस्तां में जला है आशियां अब आज से फुर्सत ही फुर्सत है. I will choose twigs again in the garden for my nest. My home has burned. From today, I have all the time in the world. A friend recited this couplet to me in the waning days of the month of Ramadan in 2019. It was a few days after the results of the parliamentary elections held earlier that summer had been declared. The BJP, despite shock demonetization and other measures, which had proved to be incredibly disruptive to the economy, had won a resounding majority in parliament and a larger percentage of the vote than in the previous election, which had brought Narendra Modi to power at the center in 2014. The anti-Muslim and anti-Pakistan sentiment fanned by the BJP had proved to be incredibly popular. Any hopes Muslims had had of the fundamental tolerance of their fellow Indians, which might lead to a disgruntlement with Modi and the politics of anti-Muslim sentiment pursued by his government, was now extinguished. The secularism of the Indian Republic, long cherished by Muslims and other minorities, seemed dead in all but name. In the tradition of ghazal poetry, poets often spoke in the interior voice of birds, as in the above couplet by Mehboob, or the following famous couplet by Ghalib. Kafas mein mujhse rudade chaman kehte na dar hamdam, giri hai jis pakal bijli, wo mera ashiyan kyun ho. In the cage, don't be afraid of telling me the events of the garden, friend. The one on which lightning fell yesterday, why would it be my nest? This identification with birds in the Urdu poetic universe is strongest when expressing one's inner state when confronted by calamity. Lightning striking the nest, destroying everything that you have painfully built up. This is what gives Azad's epistolary tale of the Sparrows such resonance for its readers in the post-colonial and post-partition subcontinent. Azad brought together the rich tradition of Urdu and Persian poetry, languages symbolically and metaphysically rich with the language of birds, with his experience of the very real, very unique birds with distinct personalities that he became intimate with in their shared space of dwelling. Through their mutual experiments in intimacy across differentials of power and species boundaries, Azad and the Sparrows together crafted an allegory which was far more hopeful. If we are to read Azad's letters following Mufti as an allegory about the relation between majorities and minorities, then the birds as minorities play a surpassingly agentive role in Azad's account. First, by refusing to cede their ground, despite the hostility showed by a larger and much more powerful adversary, they compel the adversary to give up hostilities and make adjustments and compromises. Then, as the adversary resolves to make overtures towards the minorities he cannot get rid of, the birds win him over with their actions and character, with what we can characterize as their ethical practice. This male sparrow's confident step was such a heart-pleasing happening that at the very moment I resolved that I had to have more frequent relations with this man of action. I named him Qalandar, for in the acts of his heedlessness and freedom, there was also a gallantry. And ultimately, there grows between the minorities and their adversary not just admiration, but what can only be called love. Both our tongues remain silent, but our eyes have begun to speak. The remaking of relationships has needed an ascesis or ethical adjustments, not just on the part of the more powerful adversary, but also on the part of the minority. For them, the journey has been one which moves from fear to courage to love. This was a journey that Azad repeatedly asked Indian Muslims to make, both before and after partition. To not think of themselves as minorities in the sense of being powerless and at the mercy of the majority. December 2019, women from Shaheen Bagh and adjacent Muslim neighborhoods started occupying the stretch of highway just south of Shaheen Bagh after news of the brutal police attacks on the students of Jamia Millia Islamia during protests against the Discriminatory Citizenship Amendment Act, or CAA. Shaheen Bagh is one of several interconnected Muslim neighborhoods, which are collectively known as Jamia Nagar, that have grown around the campus of Jamia Millia Islamia and are connected to that university through multi-generational ties of education, employment, patronage, and pride. The sit-in at Shaheen Bagh became a symbol of resistance to the CAA. Hundreds of thousands of people joined in solidarity, and this continued for 100 days, despite concerted state opposition, until it was called off in late March 2020 because of the coronavirus pandemic. I spent some nights at the Shaheen Bagh protests at the end of February and the beginning of March 2020, just days before the spread of the coronavirus pandemic shut down much of the world. Shaheen Bagh was full of avian imagery, drawing upon the name of the development, which itself was inspired by Allama Iqbal's frequent use of the imagery of the Shaheen or falcon in his poetry. Hum is Bagh ke Shaheen hain was a phrase that appeared in graffiti and posters all around Shaheen Bagh and on social media. We are the falcons of this garden. A large canvas made by the Fearless Collective, proudly used as a backdrop to the sit-in at Shaheen Bagh, showed the craggy profile of one of the dadis, grandmothers of Shaheen Bagh, embraced by the spread wings of a falcon and the words, Main Shaheen hu, I am a falcon. The falcon is a symbol of bravery, not just in Iqbal's poetry. It was easy to see the resonance. And yet, Iqbal's vision of the falcon is arguably somewhat at odds with the collective ethos of Shaheen Bagh, where people came together across radical differences of age, gender, religion, and ideology to create a space which imagined alternate futures. In another oft-quoted couplet, Iqbal says, Nahi tera nasheman qasr sultani ki gumbad pe, tu shahi hai basera kar pahadon ki chattanon par. Your nest is not on the dome of the Sultan's palace. You are a falcon, dwell on the mountain cliffs. Iqbal's Shaheen goes it alone, migrating away from worldly power. What I saw at Shaheen Bagh reminded me much more of the nest building of the sparrows that shared Maulana Azad's room, who continued to flourish in the face of a much more powerful adversary. The bravery of staying put and claiming space in the face of assault, continuing to dwell and imagining a better future in a space of devastation. The need to nurture future generations, a feminine and maternal aspect of avian life that gets left out of Iqbal's soaring and masculine philosophical vision. After all, the mothers and grandmothers of Shaheen Bagh came out in protest after the children and grandchildren were assaulted within the space of the university. They created a new nest in which visions of a radically different future for India were nurtured, not on the cliffs of faraway mountains, but in a space on the side of the road. Azad's story of the sparrows concludes with the tale of Moti's nest and her child. For a long time from Moti's nest, Azad writes, there was the sound of a child. He describes with loving detail how much effort Moti spent into taking care of her child. He tells us of how he once saw her flying back and forth with grains for the chick 7 times in 1 minute. And as the wings of the children keep growing, the angel of instinct, Vijdan ka farishta, appears and starts whispering in the mother's ears that now they need to learn how to fly. It appears that this whispering had begun in Moti's ears. What do I see one morning that when she flew down from her nest, with her came a small fledgling half flying with weak wings and fell to the ground. Moti would repeatedly go to the child and gesturing to him to fly would start flying upwards, but the fledgling showed no sign of this having any effect. He was lying without any movement, wings spread wide, eyes closed. Azad picked up the fledgling and placed him on the rug. Moti kept bringing rice grains to feed him. The fledgling would eat these grains, but otherwise remained still and silent with his eyes closed for the next 2 days. My thought was that he would not survive, but on the 3rd day in the morning, a strange matter presented itself. A line of sunlight had entered deep into the room. The fledgling went and stood in this. His wings were dropping. His legs were bent. His eyes, as usual, were closed. Suddenly, I see that he had opened his eyes and his whole body is trembling. Then he lifted his neck and started looking out towards the open air. Then he pulled in his fallen wings, opened and closed them a couple of times. And then when he leapt and flew, like an arrow, he reached straight to the Maidan outside. And then like a shot fired in the air, he flew into the sky and vanished from my view. This scene was so strange that at first I started doubting my eyes. Where was the condition of helplessness and distress where the mother anxiously took care of him for 2 days, but he couldn't even fly up a hand's width? And where this revolutionary fervor of reaching the sky's furthest limits that in his very first flight, he breaks all the ties of the world of customs and limitations and disappeared into its boundlessness. Really, this was nothing but an ordinary spectacle of the miracle making of life, which passes before our eyes all the time, but we never want to understand it. This fledgling sparrow was filled with the potential for flight. He had emerged from the opening of his nest and was standing in front of the winds in the sky, but his feeling of self-knowledge, khud shinasi, had not awoken yet. But as soon as the sleeping self-knowledge awoke and he attained the interior or Gnostic knowledge, irfan, that I am a bird who flies, suddenly his lifeless form was filled with new life. As if the revolutionary turning from weakness to strength, from forgetfulness to awakening, from winglessness to flying high, and from death to life happened within the blink of an eye. In exactly the same way, when man's self-knowing remains asleep inside him, no tumult from outside can awaken him. But as soon as his inner knowledge awakens and he knows the truth hidden inside him, then within the blink of an eye, the revolutionary overturning of his condition reaches its climax. And in one leap, he reaches from the dirt to the highest skies. In Azad's letters, the self-knowing and soaring flight of the fledgling sparrow comes at the end of a long process. First, the birds stand their ground and refuse to abandon their nest. Then they overcome their fear to create the possibilities of flourishing in love while sharing a space with a much more powerful adversary. Then they give birth to and nurture the young through adversities and setbacks, till the young fledgling attains self-knowledge of his true potential and is ready to soar. In many ways, this parallels what happened at Shaheen Bagh and other similar protest sites throughout the country. Created in a response to the attack on their children and grandchildren, these spaces were spaces of protest that were also spaces of nurture. Mothers brought their children to the protest, including those just months old, and informal classrooms, libraries, creches, and art studios soon blossomed alongside the protest. Flocking to these nurturing spaces created by their elders, young Indians, Muslim and non-Muslim, dared to imagine and create an India radically different from the country they saw around them, a space of radical inclusivity, of the solidarity of the oppressed, of education for the marginalized, of bus stops turned into libraries. For many, the experience of being in these spaces was one of the awakening of self-knowing, khud shinasi. Young women and men came out of their experience of Shaheen Bagh knowing that they could organize, that they could argue, that they could convince, that they could lead, that they could be artists and visionaries and politicians and activists, that they could make a better India and a better world. In Jamia, in Gulbarga, in Shaheen Bagh, in Aligarh, in Lucknow, in the spaces of nurture created by the elders in the face of state violence and adversity, those kids began to fly. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivek Saab. Wonderful, wonderful presentation. And really, we learned a lot about Azad. Amir Mufti Saab given this similar topic last year, I think, on Azad. Well, before we go on in question and answer session, we should hear from Dr. Shaunna Rodrigues for the concluding remark. Dr. Rodrigues, please. Where are you?
Yeah, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you, Anand, for this, wonderful paper, such a deep reflection on Azad. It's great to see, writing and work on Azad and Azad getting his credit, not just as someone who was a nationalist leader, as many people often remember him to be, but someone who's a deeply philosophical thinker and someone who thought about politics, not just through its, everyday realities, but as something that has to be infused with moral and ethical ideas. The paper was so rich in anthropologically thinking about Azad in contemporary India, the relevance of his political and ethical and moral thinking or thought for contemporary India. And I think that is a project that is just so important. And Very grateful to you actually for being able to bring out, the rich relevance of Azad thinking for politics in contemporary India. Let me start. My comments are, around three major ideas that you put forward in this paper. You start off the paper with the idea of Muslim persistence in India. And my three questions really, move forward from that. What does this persistence consist of, first? Second, why does Maulana Azad represent this persistence? And third, how or why is the exercise of Muslim persistence to be understood as the exercise of minority agency? Let me move into my first question. Muslim persistence, as you argue, seems to be driven by a conception of Muslims as a minority, where the minority refers to what Anand calls a morally agentive category following Azad, rather than simply being a demographic category of those categorized as a religious minority. Azad in particular represents this persistence because he lent a substantive content and force to what it means to be moral agents as minorities, especially in a deeply diverse democracy such as India. And this substance comes from this idea that Anand develops of Sulah in his paper. He translates this idea as the accommodation of and making peace with those whose differences one has to tolerate. But as he points out, the force of the word for those who structure the world through a discourse shaped in and by Urdu makes Sulah into a concept that indicates something far more than just accommodation and peace. The force of the word systematically drives a thicker meaning of Sulah, which begins with peace and accommodation, but means something far more. And Anand describes it as a habitus that one aims to embody in fashioning a self that lives amidst diversity. Here I want to pause and reflect on this idea of Sulah a little bit more, as there are two sides to it. First, as an idea that reflects a habitus, and second, as an ethic that one agentically and consciously seeks to cultivate in this process of shaping the self. As a habitus, there is an inexorability to Sulah in India. It is shaped somehow by non-agentic, deeply ingrained dispositions, shaped by our linguistic understandings of the world, the beliefs that we acquire through socialization in the particular world that is India, and India that has been shaped by Islam for more than a millennia, as much as it has been shaped by other traditions. As an habitus, Sulah reflects the internalized norms, values, and expectations that people, particularly people shaped by traditions of Urdu in India, and therefore the individual's perceptions, preferences, and actions, how they interpret and navigate the world around them subconsciously without them becoming fully aware of it, is somehow ingrained in this idea of Sulah. Or that is something that I got from your paper, Anand. There is an inevitability to this existence in diversity that shapes this habitus of how one has to exist in difference, whether one is a minority or not. The second idea is the idea of agentic action. And here Sulah requires ethical progress. There is a process that the self has to go through, that the self has to cultivate repeatedly in order to make progress on how one can exist amongst difference that one has to tolerate. So one doesn't view the self there, at least in Azad's perception, as having compartmentalized modes of being, such as a private self, which holds internal beliefs of religion, And then, a different compartment where you have a distinctly secular political self. And then also another compartmentalized position where you have a separate, probably unconscious attention to the non-human world, nature around us. Rather, the self that Azad consistently puts forward across all his writings, from Gubare Katir to his speeches as a president of the Congress Party, and to his theological work in the Tarjuman Quran, is a self that exists in a world shaped by God's providence or rububiyat. And this self cultivates peace and accommodation with the diversity and difference it encounters in the world that it dwells in, because it wants to know the other. And by knowing the other, just like Azad came to know Kalandar and Moti, the sparrows that he shares his cell with, his prison cell with, one learns so much more about oneself as well. Not only about how oneself is different from the other, but what it means for one's self to exist amongst diverse others. So I think, this is this, fascinating idea that we get from Azad. It's deeply philosophical, it's deeply ethical, and he's constantly reiterating to minorities across India that you can be confident about who you are in this land where your, the moral perspectives that you adhere to are not dominant, because there is a way in which we exist, fuller, where we constantly know ourselves through how we know the other. And I think that is something that is relevant to contemporary India today. So let me come to my third question. How or why is the exercise of Muslim persistence understood as the exercise of minority agency? And why should minority agency be thought of through the idea of Sulah? So first, I think what Sulah does and what Azad does is put aside ideas of toleration that have dominated the world, particularly through notions of imperialism, modern European imperialism in general, and liberal imperialism in particular, which is a Lockean conception of toleration, one that is not based on the knowledge of the other, but rather through a thin conception of respect for the right of individuals to have private beliefs of their own. And in constantly asserting the privateness of belief, we cannot know what the other really believes. And therefore, this thin conception of respect has repeatedly, for the last 5 centuries, proven so ineffective in really shaping diverse polities, diverse societies. Azad instead is putting forward, I think, a different conception, and one could call it a different conception of toleration, but one needn't call it a different conception of toleration as well. One that requires dwelling, that is captured not only by our existence in a world that we are thrown in, this habitus that we inevitably occupy in a diverse society like India, but in a world that we agentically shape through an ethical practice of self-knowledge that is gained by our interaction and reflection on knowing the other. This is a world that, because it has been constructed through the agentic actions of people like Azad, it's a world that is impossible to get rid of in India, no matter how many mosques are demolished or how many Muslims are jailed. And I think Azad brings to it something that is not just a conception that involves sharing a world with diverse human beings, but is able to bring God's providence, this world that we share with non-human, into thinking about such a conception of the self. So we're not just learning about the other from what we see, in people who share different beliefs, but different creatures that we share our world with. And as you argued, Anand, this world is shaped this idea of toleration is not just shaped through a deep idea of respect. There's something more involved. There's an intimacy involved in that knowledge that leads to admiration, that leads to esteem, and probably even to love. So where is this conception today? Why is it that Azad, who provided us such a deep way of thinking about ourselves and the other, it just does not exist in India? Where does the blame lie? And does it lie only with Hindu majoritarians? Of course, we can keep criticizing Modi and Hindu majoritarians, but at many different levels, these are also people who are not interested in knowing the other. They want it's their way or the highway, and therefore, who else can we blame? Can we blame secular India? Has secular India adopted a Lockean conception of toleration based on a thin conception of respect, and therefore ignored what Azad told us, and maybe what several other people also told us in different ways, not in the way in which Azad did in India's anti-colonial movement, that knowing each other, constructing ethical practices of knowing each other is how we can shape a moral conception of politics in India. And maybe Shaheen Bagh is a reminder of this for secular India, a reminder that India need not be secular when it is knowing the other, but can adopt these various practices, bringing this idea of Sula to the fore in thinking about how we can live with the other. Okay, I'll stop here. I have so many more thoughts, but I'll write to you with them. Thank you so much for this wonderful paper.
Thank you so much for such an articulated remark. It's wonderful. So thank you all three speakers. It was a very very good session. We learned a lot. And now we are going to a question and answer session. But before that, let me show you a poster for the coming Saturday. Rafat, can you show it? Yes, at the end of every month, last Saturday, we bring Danish Iqbal, who brings always a news theme. So coming Saturday, we will have on Da with Shelly Kapoor and Danish Iqbal. So don't miss that event. Okay, so let's move to question and answer session. Unfortunately, Rafat, take it out, please. Thank you. Rafat is busy in a meeting, so probably...
No, sure. Do you want me to take?
Yeah, take it out. Okay, thank you. So...
Sorry.
Would you be able to take question answer, or you are busy?
No, I am busy.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you. Okay, so now, instead of Rafat, today, me, a little less articulate person, will take care of question answer session. You can either raise hand or raise your digital hand. You all are unmuted. You can unmute yourself. So please ask questions. Anybody? Let's start with I don't see any raised hand. Yes, Sanobar Umar. Hi, Sanobar. Yeah.
Hi, Azad. Assalamualaikum. Thank you, Anand, for this brilliant presentation. I'm sure, as you can see in the chat box, everyone is very delighted to be here and listening to you. And in many ways, your presentation was truly uplifting. And I say this as an Indian Muslim academic. There's such few of us who have tenure track positions in North America, and even lesser in India, from what I understand now. So really wonderful to see this presentation. Some of my questions are a little bit like Shaunna's. I think we're somewhat on a similar page, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this. So I'm from Lucknow, UP, and for my work, I had to use a lot of archives, obviously, from the city, which I was looking into. And one of the centers that I came across over there was the Maulana Azad Center. which is hidden away, far away from the main city. It's in a very poor condition, completely dilapidated. And that's where you would find some of the most rich Urdu archive sources, for example, in this. It's called the Maulana Azad Library and Archival Center. What I thought was fascinating was that when I asked the local archivist over there, why didn't so many people know about this center? He said it's because, firstly, the name Maulana Azad in a place like UP invokes a lot of hostility. So they don't want the government or anyone or those right-wing Hindus who are currently ruling the state to be too visible in front of them. So one of the things that struck me was how Muslim agency, there are like different kinds of agencies. And often that agency is not an agency of making yourself visible, making yourself heard, these stereotypical activist associations of agency. Sometimes that agency also requires you to invisibilize yourself or to hide away. And I think this further taps into intergenerational Indian Muslim politics. A lot of young Indian Muslims have often complained that our parents or our grandparents' generation was too not subservient, but they would always say khamosh raho, like don't make a scene, don't create a fuss, khamosh ho jao, so there was like maybe the chidiya, maybe the birds would have, agar khamosh rehti, itna shor nahi kar rahi hoti, maybe Maulana Azad wouldn't have noticed them. And that would have been a better way to exercise their coexistence in his house. So there is that concept of agency too, which of course is being re-examined and reconsidered. So I was just wondering, thinking about the different kinds of agency Indian Muslims are trying to exercise, and not all of that agency necessarily looks like resistance.
Right.
And then the other thing about Shaheen Bagh, which again I find so fascinating, right? The way we often talk about Indian Muslim women resisting in academia is like, I went for another lecture where someone was like, oh, this is a fight for secularism. And it's like, no, it's a fight for the survival of our children, our grandchildren, like you said. But I'm always struck by the fact that, so for example, even my khalas and pupis and my mother and everybody were a part of those kind of protests all over India. But I asked my mother this, and she said, yeah, most of us deliberately did not carry images of Maulana Azad. We carried images of Ambedkar, but not Maulana Azad. And like when
Hello, please be more brief, because others are also waiting for it.
Yeah, so when I try to ask people like, why are they carrying Ambedkar and not Maulana Azad, or why not the two of them, I think it'll be interesting to hear this idea of like Ambedkar represents secularism in the constitution, but why is again Azad's images being downplayed in these kind of protests? And lastly, and I'll end this quickly, what Shaunna said about the flagelling bird, Hindutva doesn't have the moral compass right now to examine itself, examine how other right things. So that's it. I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Yeah.
Thank you, Sanobar, and very glad to meet you. And thank you, Shaunna, for those really rich philosophical comments, and I hope we can continue that conversation. Sanobar, I think that question of agency is a really brilliant one, especially the idea of khamoshi. So what I presented is part of the book I've written right now, at least the first draft. And one of the chapters in that book is actually thinking about what agency looks like, what religious authority looks like in this time, particularly when we have, as you said, right, what does it look like intergenerationally, where young people are connected to social media and like doing things that kind of make statements and make changes. How does that actually interplay with older modes of authority? So khamoshi, right? Silence is actually a very important mode in the way in which it interplays with loud social media presence. So for example, I'm thinking about joint Sunni Shia namaz that's happened in Lucknow and Delhi, or was happening at least before the pandemic. And those, they're not happening in, against what the Maulanas are saying, but the Maulanas, it's happening in cooperation with the ulema, except the ulema can't publicly say things because, that will lead to bawal. So there's like a silent support for things that young people are doing. I think, absolutely, right. Resistance is obviously not the only mode of agency. And I think any account of agency needs to take into account things like khamoshi as modes of action, right? As modes of acting and being in the world. And, absolutely. And Shaheen Bagh is not, I think my answer to your question, I think is, allows me to respond to Shaunna too, right? I think the problem, Shaunna, you're exactly right. I think the problem with Indian secularism has exactly been that Lockean idea of interiorized self and belief. So people don't know what Muslims believe, right? Which then leaves the field open for people like Hindutva who are, for Hindutva Wadis, I should say, who are actively cultivating, they have a nationalist ideology, right? They have 19th century European nationalism as their intellectual DNA, which believes in one nation, one blood, purity of blood, all of that, and which actively cultivate hatred and distrust of Muslims, right? So because they are working against a framework where even the secular tolerant, the liberal, don't know anything about Islam, it's so easy, right? That you're kind of ceding the field to them. So and Hindutva does not have a moral compass because, again, they are committed to I think they do have a moral compass, and their moral compass is one of, 19th century nationalism, which, as we have seen, has resulted in things like, the National Socialist Party in Germany. So that kind of thinking is genocidal. Can we have an alternate moral compass? That needs an engagement with both Hindu and Islamic traditions, and and that, I don't know, it's not about reclaiming secularism. It is about reclaiming the ways in which people have historically lived together, which is not about secularism, but which is about knowledge of the self and the other. I think what Shaunna said, I think that was a brilliant statement, right? That we constantly know ourselves through how we know the other, right? And I think that's what needs to be recovered.
All right, next question is from Dr. Fazlur Rahman Khan. Fazal bhai.
Yes, thank you for excellent talk and very informative. It's always a pleasure to hear about Maulana Azad philosophy by anyone. My question to Dr. Taneja and Dr. Rodrigues is, what made you interest in studying Maulana Azad? Especially, he has been almost forgotten in Indian politics. So what interested you to study about him?
Shaunna, do you want to go first?
No, I mean, I think there are two things. One, I think, is his beautiful mind. He wrote such fascinating work, and I studied his work as a student when I was doing my master's. But I think second, I think Azad is not a minority figure as much. I think we don't write about Azad enough, but people remember Azad, as Anand said, his statues are everywhere in India. Everybody knows who he is. Everyone knows the name Maulana Azad, but we don't know what he said. And maybe that was the impetus for me.
Yeah. Thank you, Shaunna. Similarly, for me, what was important about Azad and the reason that I kind of got into him was, the fact that he's such a major figure and we don't know what he said, exactly like Shaunna said. So if you watch the film Gandhi, which we all watch on October 2nd every year, the David Attenborough film, he doesn't, Maulana Azad is a character is present. We don't ever see him speaking, right? Nehru speaks, Gandhi speaks, Jinnah speaks as the villain, and there's nowhere else, right? Like, and Maulana Azad is a major figure. And I think what attracted me to him was in about 2017, I was in the US at that time. I think that's when Junaid's lynching had happened on the train. That was a period where suddenly that just really clarified, because the lynchings had been going on for 2 years, and the question just came to me, right? What, sitting in the US, you didn't really see, all you see was Muslims being victims. But that didn't seem right. I was like, I'm sure people are trying to articulate what is happening. And at that time, I think I read an article by S. Irfan Habib, who was talking about Maulana Azad and his political vision. And I read earlier Azad's essay on Sarmad Shaheed, which had been translated by Sayyida Hamid. So I already knew that he was a figure who was a very original thinker about intercommunal relations. So, and when I got to India, I realized that he was being, like the event that I talked about, Maine Tumhe Pukara, his memory was being revived because people were looking for answers to how to deal with the problem of communalism. And so, because I'm led by anthropology, right? I'm led by what people are saying. Going to Azad was just the natural thing for me to do at that point.
Next question is from Dr. Salman Qureshi sir from Canada.
Thank you, Dr. Anand. This was a brilliant presentation. And my question is really about the reason for Azad's ideas not percolating down to, let me use this word, masses, but you can say general public. Because I asked this question in the context of Amir Mufti, to whom you referred, and also a book by Pankaj Mishra, who wrote a book called The Age of Anger. And his contention is that Nehru and secular ideas have not percolated down to the masses because they've been carried on in the liberal elite language and environment. So to what extent do you think, because Azad clearly was not a mass leader like Nehru and like Gandhi especially. So to what extent do you think this idea of a rational discourse trying to persuade people for the agency that minorities should have, when we know that even Nehru's ideas, which Amir Mufti feels are a shade lower in terms of the agency for minorities, why haven't they percolated down to the general public? That's my question, really.
I don't know if they haven't. So I'll say one thing. I think one of the things that I find very interesting about Maulana Azad, and I think Shaunna can speak more to this, is that he really is very knowledgeable and in the Islamic tradition, right? In its breadth, right? He's an inheritor of poetry, of philosophy, of rational sciences. So, and to say that he's not a mass leader, his personality, he is a very scholarly personality. But if we take the example of just, for example, the khutbah he gave at the Jama Masjid, which people still remember. So, oh yeah, there were people who are alive, who I've spoken to, who remember that I was about to leave and I was at, I heard that speech and I gave up my, I didn't go. So to think of him as an ineffective leader without a mass base wouldn't be quite accurate, right? Because I think he does have, he did command a lot of religious authority and people did listen to him. In the years 1942 to 1945, he was, like all the leaders of the Congress, in jail. How did that affect, how the Muslim League became more popular? Those remain speculative questions. But I think a primary reason for him he is still very popular among people who read Urdu, right, and who know Urdu. And that might be the answer to the question. With the absence of Urdu literacy in India, what happens to Urdu intellectual and spiritual discourse? And I'm using both of those together because with Azad, it is very hard to separate one from the other, right? His intellectual discourses, as Shaunna has pointed out by talking about rububiyat and lordship, is a spiritual discourse, and which has profound resonance. And I think the reason that he's not so well known is because we also we haven't really promoted either Urdu or Muslim history, Muslim intellectual history in post-partition, post-colonial India. Shaunna, would you like to add to that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything to add to it because I think you gave a response which I would also probably provide.
All right. So next question. Yeah, you want to say something or no?
No.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Amir Sayyid Amir sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have to say that I was very impressed, Dr. Anand Taneja, how he conflated the story of the birth as related by Maulana Azad in his remarkable book, Khatir, to the current situation in India and the general philosophy of Maulana Azad. Very clever. I will have a hypothetical question. Maulana Azad, during the freedom struggle, was, as somebody pointed out earlier, was really not very persuasive to the Muslim majorities, Muslims in India, undivided India. And he, of course, did not carry a majority in his support. When Pakistan was born, he did not command particular respect in Pakistan. Now, as I say, in India also, his legacy, his memory is being wiped out by the current government, and it has been there for a while. The efforts have been like this. So one wonders, is Maulana Azad was a child-born genius. He established himself as a journalist, as a writer, philosopher, scholar, when he was in his teens. So one wonders and raises the question whether instead of he being wasted in political life, would he have not been more useful, or his memory or his imprint wouldn't be more lasted if he confined himself as a scholar, writer, a philosopher, whatever little he has left in his life, did in his lifetime, Khatir, Tafsir al-Quran, Al-Hilal and Al-Bulagh, which he edited. People still keep it very, very close to their heart. It is so impressive. So, as I said, this is a theoretical, a hypothetical question that whether we wasted, or Maulana Azad wasted himself in getting involved in politics. Thank you so much.
I don't know, Shaunna, I think you need to take this one on first.
I think it's a great question. I've often asked myself the same question, Mr. Amir. So, I mean, I think that for Azad, the political was not distinct from his philosophical or theological Islamic ideas. So he would keep saying, how can I think about common life without thinking about religion or without thinking about Islam? And so, these were not compartmentalized domains for him. He thought that the political has to be infused with moral ideas that he primarily saw as coming from religion. I think it is a secular perspective to say that, he should not have engaged with the political. There is a secular conception of the political that we use when we make that argument. And we have to use it because, of course, India has adopted that secular conception of thinking about politics. But I'll just make one final comment, which is, I think Azad, unlike many other thinkers, chose democracy. He chose he believed in it philosophically, And, that's one thing that Anand did start his lecture with, did start his talk with. Once you choose democracy, then you have to think about how to participate in it. And I think he gave us some answers there, which we can draw from his philosophical thought.
Thank you, Shaunna. And I'll just say, yeah, even if we think of Azad's political career as marked completely by failure, which I would disagree with, but even if we were to think of that, the potential he holds open in so many domains, whether it be theology, whether it be politics, whether it be ethics and interlinked, is something that really needs to be recovered at this moment. So we also have to turn to the past as holding open potential for the future, rather than just what happened. So I'll just stop.
All right. So Professor David Leliver. Yeah. You want to go ask question, David? Unmute. Yeah.
David, we can't hear you.
Well, you unmuted, so why we cannot hear you? Oh.
Still can't hear you.
Oh, I cannot just understand that why we cannot hear him when he is unmuted. Anyway, so next question, maybe he will come back again. Mr. Abhinandan. Hello, Mr. Abhinandan. You're next.
Yeah. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Taneja, for a wonderful presentation. And my question is that we have been discussing consistently, both academically and in political discourses, that there is a dearth of political leadership from the Muslim community post-independence in the post-independence India. And how relevant do you think Maulana Azad's discourse, both philosophically and politically, will be, and the revival of his discourse will be in creating a new line of leadership? I mean, there has been a new line of leadership in the wake of CAA movement, Muslim leadership, and especially the student leaders like Umar Khalid and Shahil Imam. They have kind of revived the leadership and kind of filled in the vacant positions of leadership. How important do you think Azad's discourse will be in creating a new line of leadership? And also an associated question is that I have often seen in literary discussions and in discussions with other intellectuals, and I have come to this conclusion that Azad has been increasingly sidelined as a person of literature rather than politics. Mm-hmm. So this is has kind of created a vacuum or a space in which the space which Azad's politics, which it could have filled, the idea of Sulh Kul and secularism and all of that. So do you think that we need to bring him back to politics, or kind of share him in between these two disciplines of literature and politics? So
yeah, thank you for that question, Abhinandan. And I think those divides between the literary and the political are divides, that our disciplinary divides that we bring to these things, because of the nature of modern academia. But to the question of, one of the reasons I became interested in Azad, but also in figures like, Hasrat Mohani and Muhammad Ali Johar, is that they are actually being rediscovered right now by a whole bunch of, young Muslim intellectuals who are, in the crisis that has been precipitated since the coming into power of the BJP in 2014, which becomes an existential question for Muslims. There's been a real investment in trying to find out an intellectual kind of tradition that we can belong to, right? Especially with the discrediting of state secularism. The Western model that we've been talking about, the Lockean kind of toleration. So in that context, I have seen a lot of, young Muslim intellectuals in Delhi and Lucknow turn back to Azad, turn back to Hasrat Mohani. And so that's a process that's already unfolding, right? So it's people see a need to belong to a tradition of thinking about these things, and they see that in these figures there's already kind of a deep engagement with these questions of, Muslim belonging, Muslim persistence. How do we live in a multicultural democracy? And I think Azad will become more and more important, despite the concerted efforts to, kind of delete him from the syllabus, as it were. Given that, there's already this kind of ongoing engagement, I think he will become more and more important as other figures. Yeah.
David, can you try? No, something wrong with your side. You
could type in your question.
Can you write some? Put in the chat box, I can read.
And meanwhile,
is it right in the chat box? Meanwhile, Rudrangshu Singh.
Thank you, sir. And Professor Taneja's lecture was a treat to listen to, and so was Shaunna. My question would be that you're muted.
No, I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My question would be that what was Maulana Azad's role in the creation of IITs or the modern education policy? Was he implementing the vision of Nehru, or had he had some kind of a weight to throw around?
Okay, I actually,
because he was the first education minister when IITs were created.
Yeah. Honestly, I don't know. I think he was the first education minister, so one presumes that he actually had, and given that he was intellectually, kind of a heavyweight, I'm sure he had a lot to do with the implementation of the education policy. I think Shaunna can speak much more to that. Yeah, that I just don't know enough about it. Yeah.
It's also not something that I focus on much, but I do think that, Azad played a very pivotal role in shaping the IITs. And I think Azad had some faith in science, so to speak. He did think that progress was important, and science and cultivation of education and science would enable progress in India. So he had thoughts of his own, this idea that, he's often implementing Nehru's vision, I think is, it's a bit of a myth, which undermines Azad's own contribution as an education minister. I'll stop there, but it is a fascinating topic to think about.
But we must dig deep into it, because lots of nonsense is going around Maulana Azad. So if we can counter it with the creation of IITs, because IITs have been a beacon of India's growth story all over the world.
Thank you. So, well, I'm not sure about David's situation. I've asked him to write his question, but still I don't see it. Manan Sahab, you have been putting a lot of, in the chat box, putting a lot of questions and comments. Are you able to ask directly or intervene? Hello, Manan Sahab, Dr. Manan.
Gee, sorry. I have lots of questions that I don't want to take too much of the time here. I think some of it is just how do we think about Ghubar-e Khatir as a text in its historical time, right? So it's a text that is intended as a private text, letters that are not intended for publication. So I think it is also a text that circulates, I know Anand mentioned this already, circulates in the literary realm, so it allows for another type of gloss to be put on it. So I think it would be useful for us to kind of think about how the Do Chidiyon Ki Kahani actually kind of as a text operates before the valuable work that Anand is doing, connecting it to other forms of real and imagined birds. My second, I think, related to this is based on some of the questions that have been raised already, which is, is there an archive for political action that is available for the contemporary moment in the anti-colonial struggle? And I am very, very sympathetic to that question, but I worry about, and this is not a worry for Anand's paper, but rather in general, I worry about that the work of these intellectuals and activists and journalists, and I imagine Azad within that categories, was towards resistance against colonial rule, as in the power relation between which they are writing is very starkly available. Now, you work, you are a lawyer, you're appointed, you are DC, you're taking employment money from state, et cetera, withstanding. And I don't know if that nationalism creates that relationship. And I think Shaunna's comments here are quite insightful in that we have to kind of think about the relationship to power in a much more inclusive space, as in the way in which we need to go back to these intellectuals is to kind of think about inclusivity and how to create a coexisting world when the intellectuals themselves, while this may have been a part of their thought, are engaged in a struggle for self-determination and for independence. So I think as a historian, I'm kind of wary of texts moving across space without the intellectual and material relationships of those spaces not moving with them and not informing our reading. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Manan. As always, you ask the most difficult questions. So to the question of the circulation of the text. So while it is written as a set of personal letters, intimate letters, kind of immediately upon his release, right? So he's released in 1945. Maulana Azad agrees to publish these letters because the secretary, takes them up, and by 1946 they're already published. So it is the last book of his that is published in pre-partition India, right? Now this is a time, so I think that is important because that is a moment where what the shape of South Asia is going to be is still undecided, but the problem of communalism, right, of Hindu Muslim tensions is at a peak. And so given all of that, Azad's decision to have these private letters in circulation as a literary form is worth thinking about. And because it also is what does literary circulation allow you to do, which something that is thought of as for more religious might not, right? So for example, I have a friend who's a Deobandi Imam, right, who does not read things that he considers frivolous, but he has read Maulana Azad's Ghubare Khatir because even though it's not a theological text, because it's high literature, and he would say things like Maulana Azad ko padh ke logon ne Urdu sikh li hai, right? So there's a way in which the realm of the literary allows for a circulation that might otherwise, for ideas to be circulated that might otherwise, be limited. It's the same thing with poetry, right? Poetry ends up being shairi, ends up being a kind of more universal discourse in a certain sense because it transcends boundaries. And I think the second thing, absolutely, right? A lot of these texts are written against in a time of colonial domination. And we should absolutely be, keep that in mind. But a lot of and this goes back to the question you raised at the beginning when you talked about what is the age of Hindu nationalism, right? Is it, since 2014 or is it 20th century? I think, yes, those questions become salient again post 2014, but the idea of what the shape between communities which share the space of South Asia is going to be, given that certain notions of, let us say, Hindu nationalism or Muslim nationalism, let us say, given that nationalism, right, in its kind of European form, and all of those kind of forms of Western political thought are gaining salience in the colonial moment, there is this continuity between that moment and this moment, right? How do we challenge these ideas and kind of recover a way of living together, which is, which we have developed through tradition and which we need to return to? So the political situation has changed, but the intellectual situation is actually very similar in certain ways. And that is a situation to which these intellectuals were constantly harking back. So,
David, can you try again? Hello? Professor Leliver? No. Hello? Yeah.
I would like to make a comment.
Yeah, sure.
Just a few words about Ghubar-e Khatir. I think it is one of the finest piece of literature, piece of literary work ever created in Urdu language. Maulana Azad wrote these, as learned speakers have pointed out, while he was incarcerated in the Ahmednagar fort, and he had no intention of getting this published. But he related that when he came out, and Ajmal Khan, who was his secretary, looked at these letters and he thought that would be a waste if they were not published. So they were published, but many of the first publication has many errors. Remarkable thing in Maulana Azad, all the references he gave in there was no books available in Ahmednagar fort, so it was all by memory. And Maulana Azad was remarkably able to remember and recollect all this, and most of these references he gave in memory in Ghubar-e Khatir turned out that they were correct. I think the much better edition of this book came out later on in 50s, I think, by Sahitya Academy in Delhi, the book was compiled by Professor Malik Ram, who is a great scholar now there. And that has corrected many of the errors which crept in by during the publication of the first edition of the book. And so if anybody interested in this, that Ghubar-e Khatir's edition that I am aware of, the best shape, is which came out in 50s, edited by Professor Malik Ram. Thank you.
So I'm going to read from David Leliver because he's somehow unable to communicate, unable to speak through his speaker. So it says, sorry for my technical, shortcomings. Anand has given a rich and evocative presentation. I was thinking about the site of Ghubar-e Khatir, a prison. It reminds me of Ghalib's share about the Murgha Asir in the cage, still gathering twigs for its nest. The question of the boundaries from the local to the national to the diasporas. Azad started out in political thing as a leader in the Khilafat movement, and was deeply connected to the larger Muslim world. Your comments on it, if you want to. Vivek Saab or other speakers, if you want to make any comments, that's what.
Thank you for the question and the comment, David. Yeah, I think you're right. I think even if we look at the set of references that, as Amir Saab said, while Azad sees himself as deeply anchored in India, he also sees himself connected to the Muslim world beyond, right? So his references including the reference to Mantiq at-Tayr, the conference of the birds. So he's just, I think there's a really remarkable quality, not just to Azad, but to a lot of the thinkers of that period where, it's not, they're not nationalist in the sense of ideologically where, being Indian means just being Indian. They simultaneously feel very rooted in and belonging to India while holding a world which is intellectually and culturally, much wider than the space of South Asia. And they don't see this as contradictory, right? And I think, Shaunna can say more to that. Yeah.
No, I wholly agree. And I think that's, there's a line from Azad where I'm translating it. He says that I feel like I'm existing between two worlds, one which is dead and one which is afraid to be born. And I feel like this is what he was referring to, at the cusp of partition, this worry about what will happen to that world that they occupied, because like Azad occupied this world of Islam that also shaped India. Maybe also the Persianate world. I think there is a linguistic element to it which we're not able to talk about enough because of what Anand said earlier, because we simply don't have the resources to converse in Urdu anymore.
One hand I can see Rashdia Mehreen. Hello.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Hi, Assalamu alaikum. So I wanted to ask a quick question around what a few people also have said about, Maulana Azad's kind of trust and faith in democracy, and also how Muslims, the dearth of Muslims in political sphere post-independence. So I'm just wondering, how can we explain that, in terms of majoritarianism and how India or Indian democracy failed Azad. I have another minor question, but this is kind of my more pressing question, and also in light of the current regime, and we've talked about the moral compass, and also just what place there was really there for Muslims, and how much place they could take, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I think it resonates with questions we talked about earlier. And I mean, two things. I mean, there were kind of, it's not as if there was not, Muslim political leadership after Maulana Azad. We've had, I'm just thinking of A.R. Antole in Maharashtra, who was chief minister and other things. But yeah, we don't have anyone of that prominent in public life of that intellectual caliber. And that may have something to do with the question that Sanobar asked in the beginning about, what is the mode of Muslim political agency? And was silence and kind of going along with the, existing Congress ideology one way of doing it, perhaps. That being said, I think right now we are seeing an interesting moment politically where you do have an articulate Muslim intellectual position for belonging in India being articulated, which is drawing on Urdu traditions, drawing on existing traditions rather than just being, coming from Western models. And I think the crisis of Muslim belonging in India that has been precipitated by, the coming into power of the BJP with Narendra Modi has really led to, a deepening of that engagement, and that which should result in, hopefully, in the emergence of a Muslim leadership, intellectually speaking. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
Now two more hands raised. Qaisar Naqvi Sahab.
Yes, good morning, everybody. My question is not really a question, it's a comment. Anand Sahab, once that I didn't fail noticing the Bismillah Rahman Rahim frame behind your back. It was impressive. It was appreciated. The other thing is that nowadays with all the politics going on with India and Pakistan, in Pakistan, a great majority of the Muslim intellectuals are saying Azad was right, not to leave India and all that. While they say in India, they say Quaid-e-Azam was right and it may have a separate letter. While they say the right were the Britishers who said not to give independence to these people, they will mess it up. So this is just a comment and it's not a question. Thank you. Thank you.
And Shaunna, you yourself raised the hand, so maybe you have asked the question. This should be the last question. We are already past 2 hours, so I think it is about time. Yeah, please.
Thank you. I know I've spoken a lot, so thank you for giving me some time. Anand, I think my question is about Azad's capacity to speak to diverse Muslim communities in South Asia. Often when we think about Azad, we speak about Urdu-speaking Muslim communities, and of course, Urdu is something that spreads across India. It's a sort of pan-Indian language. But in spaces and sites where we see Hindu majoritarianism being pushed back, particularly in South India, these are spaces and sites where non-Urdu speaking Muslims have been able to assert a conception of a world in India, a world that they dwell in, that is diverse, that is Islamic, and therefore should not be subject to Hindu majoritarianism, where this kind of self that you are talking about is able to be asserted, but not using the linguistic traditions, or the ways of thinking, the force of the language of Urdu. How does Azad become relevant to communities like that?
That's a really good question, Shaunna. And I'll say, so one is that one is Azad's ability to speak across theological differences, right, among Muslims. Because we know that Azad himself is kind of breaks from his, inherited, Sufi tradition of his family and identifies as a Ahle Hadith, right? But on the other hand, he has really close ties with the Jamiyat-e-Ulama Hind, with others in the, Khilafat movement, and with, a figure like Khaja Hassan Nizami, who's, of course, part of the Chishti tradition, and he writes his essay on Sarmad on Hassan Nizami's invitation. So there's a way in which he kind of navigates the multiplicity of Muslim theological positions and speaks to all of them, right? Which I think makes him very remarkable. Then to the question of why he can speak beyond Urdu, in a sense, I think two things. I think one is to think of, the Urdu intellectual tradition also does live in translation and in conversations, right? So if we think of both of Aligarh Muslim University as a site of, Muslim intellectual life, then you also have, people from Kerala and Karnataka and non-Urdu speaking places who go to Aligarh, right? So there is that kind of way in which Aligarh and Jamia and these other places where the lingua franca of discourse is Urdu, but also English and all these other languages, there is this kind of conversation. The other is to think of Azad and to think of Urdu as a language which is a Muslim, a language of Islam, right? Where the keywords, the vocabularies, the things that resonate are also things that can be found in Arabic and Persian, right? And those keywords and concepts make it into other languages that Muslims speak. It doesn't have to be Urdu, right? But because in a sense, all of Azad's, when we are speaking of Azad's ethical and theological writings, he is writing as a Muslim. And there is vocabulary there, which is easily translatable, which is not just limited to Urdu in a sense, right? So I think that would make him relevant.
All right. So now, Professor Chatterjee, all right.
Just a very quick response to somebody who raised a question about translation, which is very important because a lot of these ideas, particularly poetry, are not available to people who don't speak Urdu easily. So some translations would be great. One thing of his which is translated, which is very important, is his personal biography.
Yeah.
And he did not actually write it. He simply spoke it in Urdu. And it was taken down and written by Humayun Kabir, who was another major Muslim political figure, also education minister after Azad in India, and was both, obviously he was an Urdu speaker, he was a Bengali speaker and an English speaker. And that book is a great book. It's sitting on my bookshelf and it's a great read. It's all of those discussions about, Cripps Commission, the Cripps Mission, the Cabinet Mission, all those arguments that he had. And all along, you can see his own thinking coming through, where he was slightly removed from the kind of Western, narrowly defined secular model, which essentially said, you know what, you do your thing, I'll do my thing, but we don't have to speak to each other, which was essentially the model. And his was very much this, in order to know myself, I have to know you also.
Thank you.
So
Yeah.
that's a great book. It's a great read.
Thank you. Thank you. Somehow this, reference about that book was somehow missing during the talk. Lastly, just last one or two sentence comments from our senior member in the audience, Dr. Nazir Sahab, Dr. Nazir Ahmed sir. Quickly, please wrap it up, and it's getting late. All right.
Yes. Assalamu alaikum. Maulana Azad was a giant. He was a giant on the canvas of Indian history. And like a giant, he touched people at multiple levels, depending upon the maqam or the station that they occupy. His lasting contribution to the history of South Asia, to India, is that he presented the existential possibility that indeed the people of South Asia were a nation and could live as a nation. He was the only person with that consistent stand, not Gandhi, not Nehru, not Patel, and it's hard to figure out what Jinnah really wanted and what he achieved. His contributions as a scholar are well known. His contributions as the Minister of Education need to be appreciated. It's unfortunate that he had to implement his vision in the matrix, the explosive matrix of 20th century Indian politics. And in the process, he took some missteps. Some of them stand out as glaring examples as to what he did after the Khilafat movement, and also his role in the politics of United Punjab after the elections of 1946, which played into the hands of Jinnah. So I would posit, and I would caution our brothers and sisters, that when we pigeonhole him as a Muslim scholar, as a Muslim or a Muslim whatever, we are taking away from the grandeur that he left behind. I'll stop there.
Okay, with this note, I think we should just conclude it. Thank you all for being so patient. It is over 2 hours, so must be tiring, especially to those who are in India quite late, and even to you locally. And so it was very engaging, very nice, well articulated presentation, and it brought back Maulana Azad among us, and we keep on bringing him. Actually, this is the third presentation on Maulana Azad within these 3 years. And thank you again, and I hope to engage you guys again. Thank you, and bye. Be on coming Saturday for Dah. Hopefully, I will see some of these faces. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.